The Dakota Territory, 1883. Dust swirled like memories across the barren prairie as Sarah Coleman approached the weathered barn. Her hands trembled, clutching warm bread and a letter that could destroy everything. Inside, Ezekiel Gray Elk watched. Through wooden slats, his Apache instincts sensing danger and something else hope. Two broken souls, brought together by circumstance, now faced a choice that would echo across generations. Behind them, 7-year-old Thomas peered from behind his father's legs, eyes wide with curiosity and hunger. The bread's yeasty aroma filled the space between strangers, a simple offering that might bridge impossible divides. But in this unforgiving land, trust came at a terrible price. Would Sarah's secret tear apart the fragile connection before it had a chance to grow? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The barn door creaked open slowly, revealing a tall figure silhouetted against the harsh prairie light. Ezekiel Gray Elk stood with one hand on the rough-hewn wood, the other hidden from view, likely resting on a weapon, Sarah thought. His face remained impassive, dark eyes assessing her with the practiced scrutiny of a man accustomed to unwelcome. "Visitors, I brought bread," Sarah said, extending the cloth-wrapped loaf. Steam still rose from the crust, carrying the scent of home across the desolate yard. "I'm Sarah Coleman, the new school teacher for Cottonwood Springs." Ezekiel didn't reach for the offering immediately. "School's 10 miles east. You're off your path, Miss Coleman." His voice surprised her educated, measured, with only the faintest accent that spoke of origins far from these windswept plains. Not the voice the people in Boston had warned her about when speaking of savages on the frontier. "A fortunate detour," she replied, her own Boston accent softening as it had with each mile westward. "My wagon threw a wheel about a mile back." "I saw your smoke." Behind Ezekiel's leg, a small face appeared. The boy, no more than 7, had his father's high cheekbones and watchful eyes, but his skin was lighter, his hair falling in copper-brown waves instead of straight black. He stared at the bread with undisguised hunger. "This is Thomas," Ezekiel said, his hand moving to rest protectively on his son's shoulder. "He doesn't talk much." Sarah smiled directly at the child. "Hello, Thomas. Do you like fresh bread?" "Eh." Boy made no sound, but nodded almost imperceptibly. Ezekiel finally stepped back from the doorway. "Come in, then. Storm's brewing anyway. You wouldn't make cottonwood before it hits." The interior of the barn was surprisingly orderly. One corner had been transformed into living quarters bedrolls laid out neatly, cooking implements arranged. Precisely beside a small stone fire pit vented through a hole in the roof. The other end still functioned as shelter for a single horse and what appeared to be construction materials. "You're rebuilding," Sarah observed, noting stacked lumber and stone. "Trying to," Ezekiel replied, taking the bread and placing it on a flat stone beside the fire. The homestead house burned 3 winters ago. Thomas had retreated to a pile of blankets, where he resumed playing with a wooden horse, intricately carved with flowing mane and detailed musculature. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, each muscle and sinew captured in miniature. "Did you make that?" Sarah asked, nodding toward the toy. Ezekiel nodded once, slicing the bread with a worn knife. "I carve when there's time." "There's not much with the building. Where are you from originally?" she asked, accepting a piece of her own bread, now transformed into a peace offering returned. Something hardened in Ezekiel's expression. "My people are Mescalero Apache. I was raised on both the reservation and at the mission school." His tone suggested this was all the personal history she would receive for now. Sarah had fled Boston with a carefully constructed story, the respectable schoolteacher seeking adventure in the West. As the daughter of a prominent attorney whose scandal had destroyed their family name, She recognized another person skilled at selective disclosure. "Well, Mr. Gray Elk, I appreciate your hospitality." She watched as Thomas carefully broke his bread into precisely equal pieces before eating. "Perhaps I can assist with your wagon wheel tomorrow," Ezekiel added, unexpected generosity in his voice. "The storm will last the night." Outside, the wind began to howl like distant wolves, sealing their fates together for at least one prairie night. Sarah clutched her satchel closer, feeling the weight of the hidden letter within. She had come west to escape secrets. This remote barn, with its silent child and wary father, might offer temporary refuge, but for how long? The storm descended, with the sudden fury only prairie dwellers truly understand. Rain lashed sideways against the barn's weathered planks as thunder shook the timbers. Sarah helped Ezekiel secure the door with a wooden brace that had clearly served this purpose many times before. "Your timing was fortunate," Ezekiel said, checking that Thomas remained dry in their corner nest of blankets. "These spring storms can kill." Sarah nodded, remembering the stories she'd heard in Omaha about travelers found frozen just yards from their overturned wagons. The West forgave no mistakes. As Ezekiel stoked the small fire, the dancing flames illuminated a leather-bound Bible, resting atop a wooden crate that served as their only table. The book's spine was cracked with use, its cover darkened by years of handling. Sarah couldn't help but notice a folded paper protruding from its pages. "You're welcome to sit," Ezekiel offered, gesturing to a rough-hewn bench. His hospitality seemed reluctant yet genuine. The obligation of a man who understood survival depended on shared kindness in this unforgiving land. Thomas had resumed playing with his wooden horse, but kept casting curious glances at Sarah. Smiled at him, receiving a quick duck of his head in return. "How long have you been rebuilding?" she asked, accepting a tin cup of hot coffee. 6 months, Ezekiel replied. "We wintered in town until the snows cleared enough to begin. The barn was the only structure left standing." "It was your wife's family home?" Sarah ventured carefully. "Ezekiel's." Eyes flicked to the Bible. After a moment's hesitation, he reached for it, extracting the folded paper. "Rebecca's family, yes. This was their land for 20 years before I met her." He handed Sarah the paper, a marriage certificate, officially documenting the union of Ezekiel Gray Elk and Rebecca Johnston 8 years prior. The formal script and county seal seemed incongruously official for this primitive shelter. "A proper marriage," Sarah observed, noting Ezekiel's watchful gaze as she handled the document. "Her family didn't see it that way," he replied, carefully returning the certificate to the Bible. As he did, Sarah glimpsed pressed wildflowers between the pages, delicate purple blooms preserved with obvious care. "They disowned her for marrying me, called it a disgrace." His voice remained even, but his fingers lingered on the Bible's worn cover. Rebecca didn't care. She said home was wherever we made it together. Thunder crashed overhead, making them all jump. Thomas scooted closer to his father, and Ezekiel automatically placed a protective arm around him. "She died 2 winters ago. Fever." He spoke directly to the fire rather than to Sarah. Thomas hasn't spoken a word since. The simplicity of his statement carried more weight than elaborate grief. Sarah recognized the quiet dignity of someone who carried pain without parading it. They ate a simple meal, sharing Sarah's bread alongside dried meat Ezekiel provided. Thomas gradually hedged closer to Sarah throughout the evening, his curiosity seemingly stronger than his caution. "Have you taught before, Miss Coleman?" Ezekiel asked as they finished eating. "In Boston, yes," she answered, the half-truth coming easily after months of practice. She had assisted in classrooms, though her real education had come from years of working in her father's law office, a detail she carefully omitted. The school board in Cottonwood Springs was seeking someone with Eastern credentials. Ezekiel nodded. "They'll be pleased with your proper Boston manner, then." Sarah couldn't tell if there was judgment or merely observation in his tone. She turned the conversation toward safer ground, describing the journey west with carefully edited details of her background. Later, as Thomas drifted to sleep in his nest of blankets, Sarah caught Ezekiel watching her with that same measured assessment from when she'd first arrived. In the flickering firelight, with the storm raging outside, she felt suddenly vulnerable not from any threat he posed, but from the quiet perception in his gaze. She touched her satchel, feeling the outline of her hidden letter, and wondered. If running west had truly been far enough dawn broke with the particular clarity that follows a prairie storm, the air scrubbed clean, the horizon sharp enough to cut. Sarah woke to find the barn door open, and Ezekiel already outside, his tall figure silhouetted against the sunrise as he worked. She stepped out, wrapping her shawl against the morning chill. 20 yards from the barn stood the foundation of what would become the house, a rectangle of stacked stones forming a perimeter, with one corner already rising higher than the rest. Ezekiel methodically added stones, fitting each with careful consideration. Thomas worked alongside his father, solemnly handing up smaller rocks from a pile they had obviously gathered together over many days. The boy's serious expression mirrored his father's concentration, his small hands mimicking the precise movements of the larger ones. "Good morning," Sarah called, approaching them. "You've been up a while." Ezekiel straightened, one hand automatically going to Thomas's shoulder. "Sun's been up an hour already," he replied, as if that explained everything. "Perhaps out here?" "It did. It's going to be a fine house," she observed, walking the perimeter of the foundation. The stonework was expert, each piece fitted precisely against its neighbors, creating a solid base. "If we can finish before winter," Ezekiel said, his voice carrying the weight of doubt. Sarah studied the foundation more carefully. "You've laid it out well. My father was a carpenter in Boston before." She stopped herself. "Before I went to school, I used to help him." Ezekiel's eyebrows rose slightly. "Not the usual education for a Boston lady." "I wasn't always a lady," Sarah replied with unexpected honesty. "Just a girl who liked working with her hands." She removed her shawl, folded it neatly, and set it aside. "I need to reach Cottonwood. Spring's by week's end, but I have a day to spare." "Put me to work, Mr. Gray Elk." Skepticism flickered across his face, but necessity won out over pride. He pointed to a smaller pile of flat stones. "Those need sorting by size." By midday, Sarah had proven herself more than capable. Her skirts were muddied and her hands roughened, but the foundation's northeast corner had risen 6 inches higher under their combined efforts. Thomas had warmed to her presence, occasionally bringing her stones he'd selected, specially ones with interesting patterns or colors. As they paused to drink water from a dipper, Sarah surveyed the land beyond the foundation. The remnants of what had once been a prosperous homestead were still visible. A root cellar partially collapsed, the charred outline of the original house, overgrown garden rows barely discernible under prairie grasses. "Rebecca's father chose well," she said. "This rise catches the breeze, but should shelter from winter winds." Ezekiel nodded. "Johnston knew land. Taught Rebecca, who taught me." "You've been doing this alone?" Sarah asked, looking at the enormous task before them. His jaw tightened. "The settlers won't sell to me in town, much less help build. Those who would help fear being ostracized." Sarah understood immediately. An Apache man trying to rebuild on land that had once belonged to white settlers, regardless of his legal claim through marriage, would face obstacles beyond the merely physical. "I'll need supplies to continue," Ezekiel said, changing the subject. "But merchants in Cottonwood Springs refuse my business." Sarah wiped her hands on her skirt, mind already calculating. "I'll be passing through town on my way to the school. I could purchase what you need if you'll trust me with a list and funds." She saw the battle in his eyes, pride warring against practicality. Thomas looked between them, somehow understanding the significance of this moment. "I have a small amount saved," Ezekiel finally said. "Enough for basic lumber, nails, perhaps some glass for windows." "I'll ensure it stretches as far as possible," Sarah promised, surprised by her own investment in this half-built home. As the sun began its western descent, Sarah watched father and son working in silent harmony, and something unfamiliar stirred. Within her a sense of purpose she hadn't felt since fleeing Boston. This broken family and their determination to build something from ruins resonated with her own fractured hopes. The letter hidden in her satchel seemed to weigh heavier with each passing hour. Morning found Sarah preparing to depart. Ezekiel had risen before dawn again, compiling a careful list of supplies written in a surprisingly elegant hand. He counted out coins from a small leather pouch, each one placed deliberately on the makeshift table, as if reluctant to part with what clearly represented weeks of careful saving. "This should cover most of it," he said, folding the list and money into a small packet. "If it's not enough for the glass, the lumber takes priority." Sarah tucked the packet into her skirt pocket. "I'll return with everything within 2 days. My meeting with the school board is tomorrow morning." As she gathered her belongings, Sarah noticed a metal object partially hidden beneath Ezekiel's bedroll, the edge of what appeared to be a military medal. She glanced away quickly, pretending not to have seen, but Ezekiel's observant eyes had caught her discovery. After a moment's hesitation, he retrieved the medal, holding it in his palm like something both precious and painful. 11 years with the Army Scouts, he explained without being asked. "Before I met Rebecca." The medal gleamed dully in the morning light, a formal commendation for bravery, with Ezekiel's name engraved beneath a spread-winged eagle. "You were decorated," Sarah observed. "I tracked for them, translated, negotiated." His voice remained neutral, but Sarah sensed complicated emotions beneath. "When they needed someone who understood both worlds. And then you left, when I married Rebecca." He tucked the medal away again. The Army had no place for a scout, with a white wife and dreams of farming. Before Sarah could respond, she felt a small hand slip into hers. Thomas stood beside her, his solemn eyes looking up with an expression of ... purpose. He tugged gently, clearly wanting her to follow. A questioning glance at Ezekiel, who nodded once. Sarah allowed the boy to lead her outside and around the barn. There, in the morning shadows, stood a small wooden cross marking a grave. Wildflowers similar to those pressed in the Bible grew in a carefully tended semicircle around the marker. "Rebecca," Sarah whispered, understanding immediately. Thomas nodded, his hand still trustingly in hers. The simple gesture showing a stranger his mother's resting place conveyed more than words could have. Sarah knelt beside him, respecting the moment of silence he seemed to want to share. From the barn doorway, Ezekiel watched them, his face unreadable. When they returned, Thomas went directly to his father, who placed a hand on the boy's head with gentle affection. "Before you go," Ezekiel said to Sarah, "there's something you should know." He hesitated, pride visibly struggling with necessity. The school in Cottonwood Springs has been difficult about Thomas. Difficult how? Sarah asked immediately, concerned. "They're threatening to report him to the Indian Affairs Office for mandatory boarding school placement." Ezekiel's voice remained steady, though his hand tightened slightly on Thomas's shoulder. "Because he doesn't speak, and because of what he is who I am." Sarah felt a surge of indignation. "But he's only a child, and he's grieving." Children, like Thomas mixed blood with an Indian father, aren't given such considerations. The bitterness in his voice was the first real emotion he'd openly displayed. "They claim it would be better for him to be raised properly." Sarah looked at Thomas, seeing intelligence and sensitivity in his watchful eyes. She thought of the distant boarding schools she'd heard about, where children were forbidden their language, their customs, even their names. There are ways, she said carefully, to show progress without words, drawing, writing. I could show you some techniques used for shy students. Something shifted in Ezekiel's expression, a cautious hope. You would do that? I would. Her response came without hesitation, surprising even herself. Why? The bluntness of his question matched the directness of his gaze. Sarah considered her answer carefully. Because every child deserves a chance to heal in their own way. And because some rules are wrong, Mr. Gray Elk, even when they're written in law. As she mounted her wagon 30 minutes later, Sarah turned back to see them standing together, the tall, stoic father and his silent son framed by the skeletal beginnings of their home. She felt the weight of their expectations, their trust, settling alongside her own secrets. 2 days, she promised, and turned her horses toward Cottonwood Springs. Cottonwood. Springs rose from the prairie like an afterthought cluster of wooden buildings strung along a single dirt road, with a white-clapboard church steeple providing the only vertical ambition. Sarah guided her wagon down the center of town, acutely aware of the stares that followed her progress. A woman traveling alone still drew attention in these parts, especially one dressed in the somewhat faded finery of Eastern fashion. She reigned, her horses before the general store, gathering her composure and mentally rehearsing her story. The new schoolteacher from Boston, delayed by weather, now arriving to assume her duties. All true, if selectively incomplete. A bell jingled as she entered Payne's general merchandise. The store smelled of coffee, leather, and the particular mustiness of dry goods too long on the shelf. Behind the counter, a balding man with spectacles looked up from his ledger. "Good afternoon," Sarah said, employing the precise diction and gentle authority that had served her well in Boston society. "I'm Miss Sarah Coleman, the new teacher for the settlement school." The shopkeeper's demeanor transformed instantly from suspicion to deferential welcome. "Miss Coleman." We'd begun to wonder. "Walter Payne, at your service." He extended a hand across the counter. "The school board mentioned you were expected last week. Weather and a troublesome wagon wheel conspired against me," she replied with a practiced smile. "But I've arrived in time for the start of term, thankfully." As she spoke, 2 women browsing fabric bolts turned to study her openly. Sarah nodded politely in their direction before returning her attention to Mr. Payne. "I find myself in need of supplies before proceeding to the school," she explained, producing Ezekiel's list from her pocket, but not the one in his handwriting. She had transcribed it carefully, adding a few items of her own. "Would you be able to assist me?" While Payne gathered her requests, Sarah casually drifted toward the store's bulletin board. Notices for church socials and livestock auctions competed with wanted posters and official announcements. Her attention caught on a particularly disturbing notice. Warning: citizens are advised that unauthorized persons claiming ownership of territorial lands will be subject to removal and prosecution. Report all suspicious settlement activity to Sheriff Mills. Below. This official notice someone had scrawled in crude letters. No Indians or sympathizers. "Terrible business, that," Mr. Payne said, noticing her attention on the board. "That Indian squatter trying to rebuild out at the old Johnston place. Been causing quite a stir." Sarah kept her expression neutral. "Oh? Married the Johnston girl?" "Years back, if you can believe it. After she passed, he disappeared for a while. Now he's back, claiming the land is his." Payne shook his head. "Sheriff's been meaning to run him off proper, but hasn't gotten around to it yet." "I see," Sarah murmured, turning away from the board. "How unfortunate. Best keep your distance." "From that area, Miss Coleman," one of the women interjected. "That savage has a half-breed boy with him. Not safe for a lady alone." Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks, but maintained her composed expression. "Thank you for your concern, Mrs. Hargrove, Millicent Hargrove. My husband chairs the school board. The woman's smile didn't reach her eyes. We're so pleased to have a teacher of her ... background. The children need proper influences. The implication hung in the air like smoke. Sarah merely nodded and returned to the counter where Mr. Payne had assembled her supplies. "Will you be staying in town tonight, Miss Coleman?" he asked. "Mrs. Tanner runs a respectable boarding house just down the street." "I'm afraid I must continue on," Sarah replied. "The school superintendent is expecting me this evening." As Payne calculated her bill, Sarah noticed a small stack of mail behind the counter. A letter addressed E. Gray Elk was visible among the envelopes. While the shopkeeper's back was turned, retrieving nails from a barrel, she made a swift incision. "I believe I saw mail for the settlement there," she said when he returned. "I'd be happy to deliver it, save someone a trip." "That's very kind," Payne replied, sorting through the stack. "These 3 are for folks out your way." "That one," he hesitated, holding Ezekiel's letter. "Well, he rarely comes to collect anyway." Sarah accepted all 4 letters with a grateful smile, tucking them into her pocket alongside the official-looking envelope addressed to Ezekiel. Only after she had loaded her purchases and driven beyond the town limits did she examine it closely. County notice regarding property claims, stamped with an official seal. Her hands trembled slightly as she secured it in her hidden compartment. Whatever game Ezekiel was playing with the authorities, Sarah now found herself an accomplice. The irony wasn't lost on her, she, who had fled the consequences of one legal entanglement, now willingly involving herself in another. 2 days later, Sarah's wagon crested the small rise overlooking the homestead. The scene below caused her heart to quicken unexpectedly. Ezekiel and Thomas working side by side, their movements synchronized in the rhythm of shared purpose. In just 2 days, the foundation had risen another foot along its entire perimeter, the stonework even more impressive from a distance. As her wagon rattled down the slope, Thomas spotted her first. The boy paused, stone in hand, then did something that visibly startled his father. He ran toward the approaching wagon with unmistakable excitement. Ezekiel straightened, watching his son's unprecedented display of emotion with a mixture of surprise and cautious pleasure. By the time Sarah pulled the horses to a stop, Thomas was waiting, his eyes fixed on the wagon bed loaded with lumber, tools, and supplies. "Well, hello to you too, Thomas," Sarah said warmly, setting the brake. "I see you've been busy." The boy nodded, his gaze moving between her face and the treasures she'd brought. Behind him, Ezekiel approached more slowly, his expression guarded, yet unable to conceal a certain anticipation. "Miss Coleman," he acknowledged, "you returned." The simple statement carried an undertone that suggested not everyone kept their promises to him. Sarah nodded, reaching for her teaching certificate, tucked securely in her jacket pocket. She had displayed it prominently during her meeting with the school, bore her legitimate credentials, serving as a shield for the parts of her story better left untold. "As promised," she replied, handing him the document. The school board reviewed. "My qualifications. I start teaching next week." Ezekiel examined the ornate certificate with its official Boston seal and returned it carefully. "Congratulations." "And I brought everything on your list," Sarah added, turning to the wagon, "plus a few extras." For the next hour, they unloaded supplies, seasoned lumber, kegs of nails, window glass carefully packed between blankets, tools, and building materials that had consumed every cent of Ezekiel's savings, and though she wouldn't mention it, a significant portion of Sarah's own funds. "You bargained well," Ezekiel observed, inspecting the quantity and quality of the lumber. "Payne never sells this cheap." Sarah arranged her features into a modest expression. "I can be persuasive when necessary." In truth, she had supplemented his money substantially, but something told her Ezekiel's pride wouldn't accept such charity. Better to let him believe in her exceptional negotiating skills than know she had paid the difference. Thomas had discovered a small package wrapped in brown paper, his name written on the outside in Sarah's careful script. He looked up at her, questioningly. "It's for you," she encouraged. "Go ahead." Inside, he found a slate and chalk, along with a simple primer used for teaching letters. The boy ran his fingers over the smooth surface of the slate with something approaching reverence. "I thought we might start some lessons," Sarah explained to Ezekiel. "There are many ways to communicate without speaking." Ezekiel's expression softened momentarily. "Thank you." As afternoon stretched toward evening, Sarah helped organize the supplies, demonstrating a knowledge of building materials that clearly surprised Ezekiel. Watching her identify different grades of lumber and discuss the merits of various joining techniques, he finally asked the question that had clearly been bothering him. "Where does a Boston schoolteacher learn construction, Miss Coleman?" Sarah hesitated, then offered a carefully edited truth. "My father built houses before his circumstances changed. I spent more time on job sites than in drawing rooms as a child." She smiled at the memory, much to my mother's dismay. "And now you teach," Ezekiel observed. "Now I teach," she agreed, offering no further explanation for the transition dot as dusk approached. Sarah reluctantly prepared to leave for the settlement school, where she would board during the week. Thomas's disappointment was evident in his slumped shoulders. "I'll return on Saturday," she promised him, kneeling to meet his eyes. "We'll have our first proper lesson then." The boy nodded solemnly, then did something unexpected. He drew a simple shape in the dirt with a stick, a crude house with 3 figures standing beside it. Sarah felt a curious tightness in her throat. Beside her, Ezekiel stood perfectly still, his eyes fixed on his son's drawing with an intensity that spoke volumes about his hopes and fears. "Yes, Thomas," she said softly. "A home for all of us to work on together." As she drove away, Sarah reached into her pocket, where the intercepted notice still lay hidden. She would need to tell Ezekiel about it soon, but not today. Today had held too much promise to shadow with legal threats. Saturday arrived with the golden light of early autumn. Sarah had completed her first days at the settlement school days, filled with curious students, cautious parents, and the constant awareness of being evaluated, not just as a teacher, but as a newcomer whose every action would be scrutinized and judged. She guided her wagon toward the homestead with a sense of anticipation that surprised her. The settlement provided shelter, but the half-built house on the prairie had begun to feel more like a destination than an obligation. This time, both Ezekiel and Thomas were watching for her arrival. They stood beside the foundation, which had transformed remarkably in her absence. The stone base was complete, and the first wooden supports stood like sentinels, marking what would become walls. "You've been busy," she called as she approached. "Daylight is valuable," Ezekiel replied, but there was less reserve in his voice than before. Thomas hurried forward, slate clutched tightly in his small hands. He had drawn something on a geometric shapes, laid out in a pattern. Sarah recognized immediately as a floor plan for the house. "This is excellent, Thomas," she said, kneeling to examine his work. "You have your father's eye for detail." The boy's answering smile transformed his solemn face, revealing a dimple that must have come from his mother. He pointed to a small square on his drawing, then to a section of the foundation. "Yes, that will be the kitchen," Sarah confirmed. "Very good." She had brought more supplies, food, additional tools, and books for Thomas. This time, Ezekiel watched her unload with narrowed eyes. "These cost more than what I gave you," he observed quietly. Sarah arranged her face into practiced innocence. "I told you I bargain well." His expression made clear he didn't believe her, but pride kept him from pressing further. Instead, he nodded toward the slate in Thomas's hands. "He's been practicing." every morning before we start working. The quiet pride in his voice touched something in Sarah. She remembered her own father's similar tone when she had mastered a new skill in his workshop, before scandal had forced him to exchange his tools for a bottle. "Let's continue his lesson," she suggested, "while we work." Throughout the morning, they fell into an unexpected rhythm. Ezekiel directed the construction with the precision of someone who had carefully studied building techniques, if not formally practiced them. Sarah worked alongside him, her knowledge complementing his in ways that allowed them to progress faster than either could alone. Between tasks, she showed Thomas letters and simple words on the slate, integrating his lessons into their work. By midday, when they paused to eat, the first wall frame stood complete. Sarah caught Ezekiel looking at it with a mixture of satisfaction and disbelief, as if surprised by what their combined efforts had accomplished. "You know more than carpentry," he observed as they shared bread and dried meat in the shade of the barn. "Your calculations for the support beams, that's mathematics beyond common schooling." Sarah hesitated, the familiar caution rising whenever conversation veered toward her past. "My father believed girls should learn practical subjects, not just embroidery and watercolors. A progressive man." "Until he wasn't," Sarah replied, then immediately wished she could retract the revealing comment. Ezekiel studied her for a long moment, but didn't press. Instead, he surprised her by sharing something of his own. "The mission school taught us mathematics, astronomy, philosophy." His voice carried no bitterness, only a matter-of-fact quality. "They believed education would civilize us, make us forget our own knowledge. Did it?" Sarah asked. "It gave me tools to navigate their world," he answered. "But some things cannot be forgotten." He glanced at Thomas, who was carefully copying alphabet letters onto his slate. His mother wanted him to have both worlds, hers and mine, the best of each. The mention of Rebecca prompted Sarah to ask, "How did you meet her?" "I was scouting for a cavalry unit. Her father's farm had been raided not by Apache, though they blamed us. I tracked the actual raiders." His eyes grew distant with memory. Rebecca was different. She saw people, not myths or monsters. As they returned to work, Sarah felt the letter in her pocket like a physical weight. A county notice she had intercepted now seemed not just a legal document, but a threat to this fragile new beginning. When she bent to retrieve a fallen nail, the letter slipped partially from her pocket. She quickly tucked it away, but not before Ezekiel's observant eyes had registered its presence. He said nothing, but the brief moment of connection they had shared seemed to recede, replaced by the cautious distance of those who recognize fellow keepers of secrets. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the half-framed wall when the distant sound of hoofbeats interrupted their work. Ezekiel straightened, his posture instantly alert. He motioned for Thomas to move behind him, a practiced gesture that spoke volumes about past encounters. 3 riders approached at an unhurried pace, 2 flanking a central figure whose badge caught the sunlight as they drew closer. Sarah recognized the lead rider from Town Sheriff Mills, a weathered man whose face seemed permanently set in suspicious lines. The deputies beside him were younger, with the overeager expressions of men with something to prove. "Stay by the wall," Ezekiel murmured to Sarah. "This isn't your concern." But Sarah had already stepped forward, brushing dust from her skirt and arranging her features into the composed expression that had served her well in Boston. Drawing rooms. Some confrontations required more than physical courage. Sheriff Mills reined his horse to a stop several yards away, his gaze moving deliberately from the construction to Ezekiel, then lingering with obvious surprise on Sarah. "Miss Coleman," he said, tipping his hat with exaggerated courtesy. "Didn't expect to find the new schoolteacher out here." "Sheriff Mills," she acknowledged. "I've been assisting Mr. Gray Elk with his rebuilding efforts." The sheriff's eyebrows rose. "Have you now?" Interesting choice of ... charity work. The pause carried clear insinuation. He turned his attention to Ezekiel. Got complaints about you squatting on Johnston property. Again, this land belongs to my son through his mother's. Inheritance, Ezekiel replied evenly. As I've explained before. So you say. The sheriff dismounted, handing his reins to one of the deputies. Got any documentation to back that claim? Ezekiel disappeared into the barn, returning moments later with the leather-bound Bible. From between its pages, he extracted the deed. Sarah had glimpsed previously a formal document with faded ink and official stamps. Sheriff Mills studied it with deliberate slowness. This deed's got some ... irregularities, missing the county validation stamp. And these markings here, he tapped a spot where the ink seemed altered, look suspicious. Rebecca's uncle transferred the deed legally after her parents' deaths. Ezekiel explained, his voice remaining calm despite the obvious tension in his shoulders. All filed with the county office. Funny thing, the sheriff drawled. County has no record of that transfer. Just the original Johnston claim. He handed the document back with obvious dismissal. This paper won't stand up. Sarah stepped forward. Surely there's a proper legal process for verifying the document's authenticity, Sheriff, rather than simply dismissing Mr. Gray Elk's claim. Sheriff turned to her, surprise shifting to something harder. Miss Coleman, you might want to consider your position here. School board's mighty particular about the company their teachers keep. I'm merely suggesting adherence to proper legal channels, she replied, employing the precise diction that had intimidated many in her father's law office. If there's a question about the deed's validity, there must be established procedures for resolution. The younger deputies exchanged glances, clearly unprepared for this poised resistance from the new schoolteacher. Ma'am, one ventured, associating with. He gestured vaguely toward Ezekiel. His kind could damage your reputation. Thank you for your concern, Sarah replied with glacial politeness. However, I believe my professional conduct speaks for itself. Sheriff Mills studied her with narrowed eyes. I'll be having a word with the school board about this situation. Meanwhile, he turned back to Ezekiel. You've got 2 weeks to produce proper documentation, or we'll be back to remove you, legally. The threat hung in the air like gunsmoke. Thomas had edged closer to the barn door, his wide eyes moving between the strangers and his father. After the riders departed, Ezekiel stood motionless, watching until they disappeared over the rise. When he finally turned to Sarah, his expression was unreadable. You shouldn't have involved yourself, he said quietly. They were being unjust, she replied. Justice is a luxury rarely extended to my kind. The bitterness in his voice was controlled, but unmistakable. Now you've drawn their attention. Put your position at risk. Sarah felt a flash of her own anger. I'm quite capable of determining my own risks, Mr. Gray Elk. Their eyes locked in a moment of mutual challenge. Then Ezekiel asked the question that had clearly been building since her arrival with the supplies. Why are you helping us, Miss Coleman? What brings a Boston schoolteacher to stand against a sheriff for people she barely knows? The directness of his question deserved honesty, but Sarah wasn't ready to offer her full truth. Instead, she gave him the portion she could. Because I know what it's like when people in authority abuse their power. She held his gaze steadily. And I know what it costs to stand alone against it. Something shifted in Ezekiel's expression, a recognition perhaps of a kindred spirit in ways neither had anticipated. Without another word, he turned back to the wall frame, lifting a beam into position. After a moment, Sarah joined him, and they worked in silence as the sun began its descent, the unspoken acknowledgement of shared purpose stronger than any declaration. The lantern cast flickering shadows across the barn wall as Sarah and Ezekiel spread the deed and related papers on the makeshift table. Thomas had fallen asleep in his corner nest of blankets, the slate with his day's work still clutched in one small hand. 2 weeks, Sarah said, examining the deed closely. Not much time, but possibly enough if we're strategic. Ezekiel's surprise at her immediate shift to planning rather than retreat was evident. We? Unless you'd prefer to handle this alone, she replied, not looking up from the document got after a moment's hesitation. He sat across from her. The county clerk claimed to have no record of the transfer when I inquired last spring. Convenient, Sarah murmured, her eyes tracing the signatures. Who was Rebecca's uncle, the one who helped with the transfer? Edward Johnston, Rebecca's father's brother. They were estranged. Edward disapproved of how his brother treated Rebecca after our marriage. Ezekiel's voice softened. He was a good man, died 3 years ago. Sarah noted the past tense with a slight frown. Are there any other Johnston relatives who might corroborate the transfer? None who would speak for an Apache claiming their family land. Sarah began organizing the papers methodically, her movements precise and practiced. The deed itself appears legitimate, despite what the sheriff implied. The county validation stamp is missing, but that's an administrative matter, not proof. Of fraud. As she sorted through the documents, her hand brushed against a small leather-bound book that had been beneath the papers. It was clearly a personal journal, the cover worn smooth from handling, a pressed wildflower marking a page. Rebecca's, Ezekiel said, noticing her discovery. She kept a record of everything: the farm, our marriage, the land transfer. Sarah carefully opened the journal to the marked page, where neat handwriting detailed the day of the land transfer. Rebecca had recorded not just the legal transaction, but her uncle's words. This land is your birthright, and now it belongs to your family, all of your family. No one can take it from you. This could help, Sarah said, genuine hope in her voice. Personal records are sometimes admitted as supporting evidence. She continued reading, finding meticulous notes about crops, weather, and daily life, but also references to hostility from neighbors, threats received, and Rebecca's determination to create a home despite it all. The journal revealed a woman of remarkable courage and clarity. She was thorough, Sarah observed, genuine admiration in her voice. Rebecca believed in preparing for difficulties, Ezekiel replied. She understood what we would face. Sarah closed the journal gently. I may be able to access county records through my position. The school board chairman's brother works in the county office. Ezekiel's expression darkened. James Hargrove. The man who wants this land. What? Sarah's surprise was genuine. The same Hargrove? Brothers. William chairs the school board. James has been buying land throughout the county, some say not always honestly. Ezekiel's voice remained even, but his hands tensed on the table. He made offers for this parcel even before Rebecca died. The pieces were falling into place: the missing records, the sheriff's involvement, the school board's concerns about Sarah's associations. This wasn't merely prejudice against Ezekiel. It was calculated acquisition. I need to teach Thomas legal terms, Sarah said suddenly. Ezekiel blinked at the apparent non sequitur. Why? Because anyone watching us should see exactly what they expect a teacher instructing a student. She met his eyes directly, not a former legal secretary examining county records. Understanding dawned in Ezekiel's expression. You worked in law. Sarah nodded, offering another piece of her truth. My father's office, before coming west. I know how land transactions are recorded, what to look for, what might have been ... altered. Across the room, Thomas stirred in his sleep, murmuring sounds that weren't quite words. Ezekiel glanced at his son with an expression of such profound protection that Sarah felt her resolve strengthen. I need to return to the settlement tomorrow, she said. Classes resume Monday, but I can begin investigating the records. They'll be watching you now, Ezekiel warned. Let them. Something of her father's courtroom confidence entered Sarah's voice. People see what they expect to see a proper Boston schoolteacher, perhaps out of her depth in a frontier conflict. She began gathering the papers, organizing them with practiced efficiency. I'll need copies of these. And we should establish a timeline of events related to the property. Ezekiel studied her with new awareness. You've done this before. Sarah hesitated, then nodded once. Yes, but last time I stood on the other side of the case. She looked down at her hands, steady now where once they had trembled with fear and shame. This time, I'm choosing my position carefully. Outside, the prairie wind whispered around the barn's weathered boards, carrying the promise of autumn's approach. Inside, two unlikely allies bent their heads over faded documents. Mapping a strategy against forces that had undoubtedly overcome others before them, Monday morning found Sarah facing 16 curious faces in the one-room settlement school. The children ranged from 6 to 14 years old, their expressions varying from open curiosity to guarded assessment. Like their parents, these young ones had learned to evaluate newcomers carefully. "Good morning," Sarah began, her Boston diction deliberate yet warm. "I'm Miss Coleman, and I'm delighted to be your teacher." A small girl in the front row raised her hand immediately. "Is it true you helped the Indian at the old Johnston place?" The directness of the question confirmed what Sarah had suspected. News traveled swiftly across the prairie. She maintained her composed smile. "I've been assisting Mr. Gray Elk and his son with their home construction. Yes, Mr. Gray Elk served our country as an Army scout for many years." This information created a ripple of whispers. Sarah smoothly redirected their attention by distributing the primers she'd brought from Town Simple, well-worn volumes that would form the foundation of their studies. "Today we begin our journey together," she announced, opening her own copy to display the carefully annotated pages. Her personal teaching primer contained extensive handwritten notes in the margins techniques for different learning styles, additional exercises, and special instructions for students who might struggle with traditional methods. She had added several pages specifically for Thomas, though these children didn't need to know that. By midday, Sarah had begun assessing each child's abilities, grouping them according to skill rather than age. She set the older students to helping younger ones, a necessity in a single-teacher school, but also a method she believed built community and responsibility. As the children ate their midday meals from tin pails brought from home, the school door opened to admit 3 visitors: William Hargrove, chairman of the school board, his wife Millicent, whom Sarah had met in the general store, and Pastor Fleming from the town church. "Miss Coleman," Hargrove greeted her, a broad man with the florid complexion of someone accustomed to comfort. "We thought we'd observe your first day." "How thoughtful," Sarah replied, gesturing to the spare chairs along the wall. "The children have been most welcoming." For the next hour, Sarah conducted lessons with calm efficiency, hyper-aware of the scrutinizing gazes, but refusing to show discomfort. When the children were engaged in writing exercises, Hargrove approached her desk. "Sheriff Mills mentioned he encountered you at the Gray Elk situation," he said quietly. "Yes," Sarah replied, maintaining eye contact. "I've been providing some assistance with rebuilding efforts. Mr. Gray Elk's son Thomas could benefit from educational support." "Admirable charity," Hargrove responded, his tone suggesting otherwise. "However, we must consider appearances. A young, unmarried teacher in such company raises concerns." "I understand completely," Sarah said, her smile pleasant but firm. "Rest assured, my professional standards are impeccable. I believe actions speak louder than rumors." Pastor Fleming joined them, his thin face creased with what appeared to be genuine concern. "Miss Coleman, we simply worry for your safety and reputation. That man's claim to the Johnston property is questionable at best." "So I've heard," Sarah replied neutrally, "though I believe there are established legal channels for resolving such disputes." My brother James handles most county property matters. Hargrove interjected. Perhaps you should discuss your concerns with him directly. The invitation was exactly what Sarah had hoped for, though she carefully hid her satisfaction. That's most helpful, Mr. Hargrove. I may do just that. After the visitors departed, Sarah released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The school day continued without further interruption, and by afternoon's end, she had begun to connect with several of the children, particularly a quiet girl named Mary, whose thoughtful questions reminded Sarah of herself at that age. The week progressed with Sarah dividing her time between teaching duties and careful inquiries about county records. On Wednesday, she met James Hargrove, himself a leaner, sharper version of his brother, with calculating eyes that assessed her value before she'd spoken a word. Miss Coleman, he acknowledged when she visited the county office. I understand. You're interested in property records. For educational purposes, she explained smoothly. I'm developing lessons on local history and settlement patterns. The children are quite interested in how their families came to own their farms. Whether he believed her or not, her credentials as the new teacher provided sufficient pretext for him to grant limited access to the public records. Sarah made careful mental notes while appearing to focus only on the most innocuous documents. Saturday couldn't arrive quickly enough. When Sarah finally returned to the homestead, the walls had risen significantly in her absence. Thomas ran to greet her wagon, clutching his slate with new words carefully printed. Teacher. He called out a single word, barely above a whisper, but clearly audible. Sarah froze in astonishment. Beside the half-built wall, Ezekiel stood perfectly still, his face transformed by a look of wonder and disbelief. His son had spoken. After 2 years of silence, Thomas had found his voice again. The following Wednesday, Sarah was organizing student slates after dismissal when a rider delivered mail to the settlement school. Among the official correspondence from the Territorial Education Office was an envelope that made her blood run cold, postmarked from Boston, addressed in the unmistakable hand of her former employer. She waited until she was alone before opening it with trembling fingers. The brief message confirmed her worst fears. Inquiries had been made about Sarah Coleman's whereabouts. The scandal surrounding her father's case had not been forgotten, and certain parties remained interested in locating his daughter, the key witness whose testimony could still damage powerful men. Sarah burned the letter in the school stove, watching the ash dissolve into nothing. She had been careful, changing her name slightly, selecting a teaching post far from established railways and telegraph lines. But distance alone, it seemed, would not protect her forever. That evening, as she prepared her lessons, a knock at her boarding house door revealed Millicent Hargrove, her thin smile failing to mask the calculation in her eyes. Miss Coleman, I thought we might have tea, she announced, already stepping inside without waiting for invitation. Woman to woman. Over the next hour, Mrs. Hargrove's conversation moved with practiced subtlety from pleasantries to pointed questions. About Boston, Sarah's family connections, and her reasons for seeking a position in such a remote location. Most Eastern ladies find our frontier life quite primitive, Mrs. Hargrove observed, watching Sarah closely. Especially those accustomed to Boston society. I find purpose in teaching children who truly need education, Sarah replied carefully. The city offers many qualified teachers. Here I can make a genuine difference. How noble, Mrs. Hargrove murmured. And yet, I wonder about your continued association with the Gray Elk situation. William mentioned you were asking about county property records. Sarah maintained her composed expression. As I explained to Mr. Hargrove, I'm developing lessons on local settlement history. The children are quite engaged. Of course. Mrs. Hargrove set down her teacup with deliberate precision. I should mention that my cousin in Boston has been making inquiries about qualified teachers. I wrote to her about you, naturally. The implied threat hung in the air between them. Sarah forced a grateful smile. How thoughtful. Though I'm quite committed to completing the term here. After Mrs. Hargrove departed, Sarah sat in the growing darkness, her mind racing. The web was tightening around her from both directions. Boston's past and the Hargroves' present suspicions. Saturday arrived with an early snowfall unusual for October, according to the locals. Sarah's journey to the homestead was slower, the wagon wheels struggling through muddy tracks. Partially covered with wet snow. She found Ezekiel and Thomas working inside the partially completed structure, the frame now enclosed on 3 sides, with the 4th wall partially boarded. A temporary tarp protected them from the weather. While they installed window frames, Thomas greeted her with growing confidence. "Teacher came," he said, his voice still soft but clear. Ezekiel nodded in greeting, but his perceptive eyes immediately noted her tension. "Something's wrong," he observed after Thomas had become absorbed in showing Sarah his progress with the slate. "Just tired," she deflected. The weather made the journey difficult. He didn't press, but his gaze remained watchful as they worked through the afternoon. Thomas's vocabulary had expanded remarkably in just 1 week, single words becoming short. Phrases as his confidence grew. As dusk approached, the snow intensified, transforming into a genuine early blizzard. The wind howled around the partially completed walls, finding every gap in the temporary coverings. "You can't travel back in this," Ezekiel said, securing the tarp over the unfinished wall. "The settlement is too far." Sarah knew he was right. The storm had developed too quickly, and night travel in such conditions would be foolhardy. Still, the prospect of spending the night here carried its own complications. "I can sleep in the wagon," she offered. Ezekiel shook his head. "You'd freeze. We have the barn, and now part of the house is sheltered enough. Thomas and I have been sleeping here rather than the barn since yesterday." They created a makeshift sleeping area in the most protected corner of the structure. Thomas, exhausted from the day's work and excitement, fell asleep quickly, wrapped in blankets near the small iron stove Ezekiel had installed. In the dim light, Sarah noticed Ezekiel watching her with that same perceptive gaze. "The school board chairman's wife visited me," she finally admitted. "She's suspicious about my interest in county records. And about me, because of your help here. That and—" Sarah hesitated. "She's made inquiries to Boston." Ezekiel's expression revealed understanding. "You're running from something too." Sarah looked away, unwilling to elaborate further. She didn't see the newspaper clipping that slipped from her journal as she arranged. Her bedding, a small headline about the Boston land fraud case that had destroyed her father and sent her fleeing westward. Ezekiel noticed it, but said nothing, respecting her secrets as she had respected his. That night, as the storm raged around their fragile shelter, they remained separated by just a few feet of physical space and the vast distance of unshared truths. The county clerk's office occupied a small room in the back of Cottonwood Springs' modest courthouse. Sarah stood before the heavy oak counter, maintaining the pleasant but determined expression that had served her well in her father's law office. "Miss Coleman," the clerk greeted her, a thin man with ink-stained fingers and perpetually squinting eyes. "More local history research?" "Indeed, Mr. Peterson," she replied. "I'm focusing on property transfers from the 1870s from my student's lesson on settlement patterns." The clerk hesitated. "Mr. Hargrove mentioned you might be by. Said I should assist with general records, but to check with him on anything ... specific." Sarah nodded understandingly. "Of course. I'm primarily interested in teaching the children how transfers were recorded, the process rather than particular properties." This approach proved successful. Peterson allowed her access to the general record books while he attended to other duties. Working quickly but methodically, Sarah located the original Johnston homestead claim, noting the precise legal description and dates. What she discovered next made her pulse quicken. Edward Johnston had indeed filed a transfer deed to Rebecca Johnston Gray Elk, properly recorded, stamped, and witnessed. But a thin line had been drawn through the entry, with a notation in different handwriting: documentation insufficient transfer, void. More disturbing was a recently filed claim notice for the same property. Petition for adverse possession, due to abandonment, James Hargrove claimant. Sarah carefully copied the information into her teaching notebook, disguising the critical details among lesson plans and student notes. As she worked, another name caught her attention: Peterson, the clerk himself, listed as witness on several of Hargrove's recent acquisitions. She was closing the record book when she noticed a woman watching her. From the doorway, an older lady, with sharp eyes and a stern mouth softened somewhat by what appeared to be carefully restrained curiosity. "You must be the new teacher," the woman said, entering fully. "I'm Margaret Wells. My daughter Eleanor was the previous schoolmistress here." Sarah extended her hand. "Sarah Coleman." "A pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Wells." Eleanor left rather suddenly. Mrs. Wells continued, her gaze assessing. "There was some disagreement with the school board." The clerk busied himself with papers, obviously uncomfortable with the conversation. Sarah recognized an opening when she saw one. "Perhaps we might continue our discussion outside," she suggested. "I'd be interested in any insights about the school's history." On the courthouse steps, Mrs. Wells spoke more freely. "My Eleanor questioned certain property transactions affecting her students' families. The Hargrove brothers made it clear such inquiries were unwelcome." "I see," Sarah replied carefully. "Boston, aren't you?" Mrs. Wells asked abruptly. At Sarah's nod, she continued, "I lived there myself years ago. Worked for a solicitor named Callahan. Fine man, though I heard he ran into troubles later." Sarah controlled her expression with effort. Callahan, her father's name. This woman had worked in his office, perhaps even remembered Sarah as a child. Small world, Sarah managed. "Mrs. Wells, might I call on you sometime? I would value your perspective on the community." "Any afternoon?" the older woman replied. "My home is just beyond the church." Riding back toward the settlement school, Sarah's mind raced with implications. The homestead transfer had been legitimate but deliberately invalidated. Hargrove was claiming abandoned property rights. And now, this unexpected connection to her past through Mrs. Wells threatened her carefully constructed identity. The weather was turning again, heavy clouds building on the horizon. Sarah urged her horse faster, knowing she needed to reach Ezekiel. Before the storm broke, she arrived at the homestead as the first fat snowflakes began to fall. Ezekiel and Thomas were hastily securing loose building materials against the impending blizzard. "Inside," Ezekiel called, seeing her approach. "This one will be worse than the last." They huddled in the partially completed house as the storm descended with startling ferocity. Within an hour, the world outside had disappeared behind a wall of swirling white, the wind finding every gap in their temporary walls. "You found something," Ezekiel observed as they worked to reinforce the tarp covering the unfinished wall. Sarah nodded, her decision made. The transfer to Rebecca was properly recorded. Someone altered the records, later likely after her death. Ezekiel's hand stilled. "You're certain?" "I've seen enough legal documents to recognize tampering," Sarah replied. "And there's more. James Hargrove has filed for possession due to abandonment." Thomas worked nearby, arranging stones to block a draft near the floor. But his attentive posture made clear he was listening to every word. "Why are you risking yourself for us?" Ezekiel asked quietly. The howling wind and the growing sense that time was running out pushed Sarah toward a truth she'd been avoiding. "Because I know exactly what men like Hargrove do to acquire what they want," she said, meeting Ezekiel's eyes directly. "I was a legal secretary in Boston. My father's firm represented wealthy clients in property transactions. She took a deep breath. Some of those transactions weren't honest. When I discovered the fraud, I had a choice: remain silent or testify. You testified, Ezekiel guessed. Sarah nodded. Against my father and his associates. The scandal destroyed our family name. Men went to prison, powerful men with powerful friends. I came west because they were looking for me. The truth, once started, seemed impossible to contain. My real name is Sarah Callahan. Sarah Coleman is my mother's maiden name. Morning arrived with blinding brightness, the storm having passed during the night, leaving behind a transformed landscape of pristine white. Sarah stood in the doorway of the partially completed house, watching her breath form clouds in the frigid air. The confession of the previous evening sat heavily between her and Ezekiel, though he had received her truth with the same quiet dignity with which he faced all challenges. I should return to the settlement, she said, turning to where he was. Stoking the small stove. The school board will expect me. Ezekiel nodded. The snow will make travel slow. Be careful. Thomas emerged from his blankets, his dark eyes moving worriedly between them. Teacher come back? He asked, the words still carefully formed, but growing more confident daily. Sarah knelt beside him. Yes, I'll return Saturday as usual. Keep practicing your letters. The boy nodded solemnly, then surprised her by reaching out to touch her hand briefly. Gesture of such simple trust that Sarah felt a tightness in her throat. I'll file the corrected paperwork tomorrow, she told Ezekiel, as she prepared to leave. There's a process for contesting fraudulent claims. We still have a few days before the deadline. His expression remained guarded. After what happened in Boston, you would risk involving yourself again? This time I'm choosing the right side. From the beginning, she replied. The journey to the settlement took twice as long as usual, the fresh snow concealing dips and holes that might catch a wagon wheel. By the time Sarah arrived at the schoolhouse, the sun was already westering, casting long blue shadows across the unbroken white. She was surprised to find 3 horses tied outside, one belonging to Sheriff Mills, another to William Hargrove, and a third she didn't recognize. As she approached the door, voices drifted through the thin walls. Absolutely certain it's her? Hargrove was saying. The telegram confirms it, replied a voice Sarah didn't recognize. Sarah Callahan, daughter of Jonathan Callahan, key witness in the Boston land fraud case. Disappeared 3 months ago after receiving threats. Sarah froze, her hand halfway to the door latch. Inside, the conversation continued. And you're authorized to return her to Boston? Sheriff Mills asked. The court has ordered her appearance to provide additional testimony, the stranger replied. Several cases remain unresolved. Sheriff Mills grunted. Convenient timing. My brother's land claim hearing is next week. I'm merely following court orders, the man replied smoothly. Though I understand your local situation might benefit from her absence. Sarah backed away silently, her mind racing. They knew. Somehow they had discovered her identity, perhaps through Mrs. Hargrove's inquiries to Boston, or Mrs. Wells's recognition. The carefully constructed facade had crumbled, and with it, her position to help Ezekiel, moving quickly but quietly. She returned to her wagon and urged the horses forward. Not toward her boarding house, but back in the direction of the homestead. She had to warn Ezekiel, to explain that she could no longer help with the land claim, that her involvement now would only hurt his cause. She had traveled less than a mile when she heard hoofbeats behind her. Glancing back, she saw Sheriff Mills and another man, presumably the visitor from Boston, in pursuit. Sarah snapped the reins, urging her team to greater speed despite the treacherous conditions. The chase ended at the edge of town, where Mrs. Hargrove and her husband stepped into the road, forcing Sarah to pull up sharply to avoid hitting them. Miss Coleman, or should I say Miss Callahan? William Hargrove said, his usual bluster hardened into something more dangerous. The sheriff would like a word. Within minutes, Sarah found herself in the small-town jail, facing the stranger who had come to return her to Boston, a court official named Bancroft with cold eyes and a colder smile. "Miss Callahan, you've led quite the chase," he said, producing a folded paper from his coat. "This is a court order requiring your return to testify." Sarah recognized the document for what it was legitimate, but likely obtained through the influence of those she had testified against. Men wealthy enough to ensure that the witness who had damaged them would face further scrutiny, possibly even manufactured charges. "I've already given my testimony," she replied evenly. "The court has my sworn statements." "New evidence has emerged," Bancroft said smoothly. "Your presence is required to clarify certain ... inconsistencies." "Sheriff." Mills leaned against the wall, watching with obvious satisfaction. "Seems you've been less than honest with our community, Miss Coleman. Harboring a false identity, involving yourself in local property disputes under false pretenses. The school board is naturally concerned," Hargrove added. "Your position will need to be ... reconsidered." Sarah's mind raced, calculating options, consequences, escape routes. But one thought overshadowed all others. She had promised Ezekiel she would file the corrected paperwork tomorrow. With her in custody, his deadline would pass unmet, and the land would be lost. "I need to send a message," she said, "to inform the settlement school of my absence." "That's been handled," Hargrove replied with smug satisfaction. "A replacement teacher has already been arranged, someone with more appropriate connections." As if to punctuate the finality of her situation, Sarah felt the letter she had been carrying, the one intercepted weeks ago addressed to Ezekiel, slip from her pocket to the floor at Sheriff Mills' feet. Sheriff Mills bent to retrieve the fallen letter, his weathered face registering first curiosity, then recognition as he noted the official county seal. "Well now, what's this?" he drawled, turning the envelope in his hands. "County notice addressed to Gray Elk, in your possession. Interfering with official mail is a serious offense, Miss Callahan." The letter, the final notice of property seizure Sarah had intercepted weeks ago, now became another weapon against her. She watched as Mills broke the seal and skimmed the contents, his eyebrows rising slightly. "Interesting," he murmured, passing the document to Hargrove. "Seems our schoolteacher has been quite busy." "I was planning to deliver it," Sarah said, the lie sounding hollow even to her own ears. Bancroft, the Boston court official, observed the exchange with calculated interest. "This appears to be more than a simple case of flight from court obligations. Perhaps you could enlighten me about these ... local complications, Sheriff." "Happy to," Mills replied, "once we've secured our prisoner for the night. She'll be on tomorrow's eastbound stage to the railway station." Sarah spent the night in the town's small jail cell, her mind cycling through scenarios with increasing desperation. By morning, she had formed a risky plan, one final attempt to help Ezekiel before she was forced to return east. "I have documentation," she told Bancroft when he came to collect her. "Evidence of local corruption involving the very property dispute you've heard about. I'd like to submit it formally before leaving." The court official studied her with professional curiosity. "I have no jurisdiction in territorial matters, Miss Callahan, but you have an obligation to report witnessed crimes," she countered, "as an officer of the Boston court." This appeal to legal procedure and perhaps his own self-importance worked as she'd hoped. Bancroft agreed to accompany her to retrieve her documentation from her boarding-house room before departure. What neither Bancroft nor Sheriff Mills anticipated was Sarah's thorough knowledge of legal procedures, including the power of evidence properly filed. Once in her room, she quickly gathered Rebecca's journal, the copied records showing tampering, and her own sworn statement that she hurriedly composed. "These must be filed with the territorial judge," she insisted. "The stage doesn't leave for 3 hours. There's time." To her surprise, Mrs. Wells appeared at the boarding house just as they were preparing to leave. The older woman took in the situation with sharp eyes, noting Sarah's valise and Bancroft's official demeanor. "I thought you might need this," she said, handing Sarah a small packet. "Copies of certain records I've kept over the years about local property transactions." Before Sarah could respond, hoofbeats sounded outside, multiple riders approaching. Fast. Through the window, she saw James Hargrove leading several men toward the homestead road. Behind them, a wagon carried lumber and torches. "They're going to destroy the evidence," Sarah realized aloud. "Burn down what Ezekiel has built before." The property hearing. Bancroft frowned. "That would be destruction of private property." "Only if Gray Elk's claim is legitimate," Sheriff Mills countered, arriving at the doorway. "Otherwise, it's merely clearing an unauthorized structure from Hargrove land." Sarah made a swift decision. "You want me to return to Boston? Fine. But first, witness what's actually happening here. As a court official, observe the evidence being destroyed, the legitimate claimant being forcibly removed." Something in Bancroft's expression shifted professional curiosity. Perhaps, or simply the instinct to witness a potential legal controversy. "Very well. We'll make a brief detour before the stage departs." They reached the homestead just as Hargrove and his men were confronting Ezekiel at the property line. Thomas stood beside his father, his small face a mask of determination despite his obvious fear. "This charade ends today, Gray Elk," Hargrove was saying as they approached. "I have the deed right here, properly filed yesterday. This land belongs to Hargrove Holdings now." Sarah dismounted quickly, moving to stand beside Ezekiel, despite Sheriff Mills' warning to stay back. "That filing is fraudulent," she called out, "and I can prove it." All eyes turned to her, expressions ranging from surprise to fury. The letter that had fallen from her pocket now lay unfolded in Hargrove's hand, her final secret exposed. "Sarah Callahan," Ezekiel said quietly, the revelation of her true identity finally spoken between them. "The witness from the Boston land fraud case." In that moment, the disparate pieces of her story fell into place for him. Her knowledge of legal documents, her ability to recognize tampering, her reluctance to discuss her past. "Yes," she admitted, loud enough for all to hear. "I testified against powerful men who used falsified documents to steal property, exactly what's happening here." She turned to Bancroft, speaking with the precise legal terminology that had once been her daily language. "As an officer of the court, you are witnessing active fraud and attempted property theft through document falsification, the same crimes being prosecuted in Boston." The packet Mrs. Wells had given her contained exactly what Sarah had hoped. Notarized copies of the original transfer to Rebecca, made before the records were altered, along with a statement from the former clerk who had processed the legitimate transaction. "This land legally belongs to Ezekiel Gray Elk through his marriage to Rebecca Johnston," Sarah continued, her voice gaining strength. "The records were altered after her death to facilitate theft. Classic fraudulent conveyance, which I recognize, because I've seen it before." Hargrove's face darkened with rage. "This is absurd. She's a fugitive, a criminal avoiding court summons. Nothing she says has legal standing." "I'm not avoiding the court," Sarah countered. "I'm avoiding the men who threatened me after I testified." She turned to Bancroft. "You can take me back to Boston. I'll testify again. But first, examine these documents." Ezekiel had disappeared briefly into the house. Returning with Rebecca's Bible, from between its pages, he withdrew not just the deed but something else, a folded quilt of intricate design, combining traditional Apache patterns with European quilting techniques. "Rebecca's mother made this for our wedding," he said, unfolding it enough to reveal the Johnston family name embroidered in one corner. Her family's heritage passed to her, and through her to Thomas. The quilt a tangible symbol of the legitimate union between Ezekiel and Rebecca seemed to affect the onlookers in ways that legal documents could not. Even Sheriff Mills shifted uncomfortably at this evidence of a real family with genuine connections to the land. Bancroft adjusted his spectacles and examined the documents Mrs. Wells had provided, his professional demeanor gradually overtaking his role as Hargrove's convenient ally. These appear to be properly notarized copies of official records, he observed, showing clear title transfer to Rebecca Johnston Gray Elk. Forgeries, Hargrove snapped, but uncertainty had crept into his voice. The Boston case involved similar tactics, Sarah explained, her legal training evident in her precise language. Legitimate deeds altered after filing, records selectively lost, officials bribed to certify fraudulent documents. She addressed Bancroft directly. You know why. I was called to testify in Boston because I recognized the pattern. I'm seeing exactly the same methods here. Thomas, who had been silent throughout this confrontation, suddenly stepped forward. This our home, he said clearly, his voice stronger than Sarah had ever heard it. My mother's land. Father build. Again for us. The simple statement from the previously silent child carried a weight that surprised everyone present. Even the men Hargrove had brought with him exchanged uncomfortable glances. Horsemen approached from the direction of Town 1 of Sheriff Mills' deputies, riding hard. Sheriff, he called as he reined in. There's trouble. Judge Wilson arrived, early for circuit court. He's asking about the Gray Elk property claim. Says he received telegrams from the territorial governor's office. Sarah felt a surge of hope. Mrs. Wells must have had more connections than she'd revealed, perhaps even anticipating this confrontation. Hargrove's expression shifted from rage to calculation. This changes nothing. The filing deadline has passed. My claim is registered. With documentation that appears to be contested, Bancroft noted, his legal mind clearly engaged now. As an officer of the Boston court, I cannot ignore potential fraud that mirrors an active case. Sheriff Mills, sensing the shifting tide, adopted a more neutral stance. Perhaps this matter should be properly heard before Judge Wilson. My brother is a respected businessman, William Hargrove protested, having remained silent until now. These accusations are outrageous. A wagon appeared on the horizon, more settlers approaching. Sarah recognized the parents of several of her students, along with Mrs. Wells and an elderly man she hadn't met. That's Jacob Turner, Ezekiel said quietly to Sarah. He was Rebecca's neighbor for 20 years. Sighed he couldn't help publicly. But ... double quotes. The elderly man climbed down from the wagon with difficulty, assisted by 2 younger men. Heard there was some question about the Johnston place, he called. Figured I should speak up after all this time. He approached Ezekiel with dignity, offering a weathered hand. Should have done this years ago, Gray Elk. Rebecca was like a daughter to me. Got letters from her Uncle Edward confirming the transfer. Kept them all these years. Thought they might matter someday. The gathering had transformed from a confrontation to an impromptu hearing, with more wagons arriving as word spread through the small community. Not everyone supported Ezekiel's claim, but enough had come to ensure that simple force would not decide the matter. Sarah stood beside Ezekiel and Thomas, acutely aware that her time was running short. Bancroft would still require her return to Boston. The stage would not wait indefinitely. But in this moment, watching the community finally engage with the truth, she felt a sense of completion. You knew this might happen, Ezekiel said quietly to her as they watched Judge Wilson's wagon approaching in the distance. That helping me could expose your identity. I knew it was possible, she admitted. Why risk it? Sarah looked at the half-built house, a structure she had helped create, alongside this man and his son, who who had somehow become important to her. Because some things are worth fighting for, even when the cost is high. Thomas slipped his small hand into hers, the simple gesture conveying what elaborate words could not. They stood together, three unlikely allies bound by shared purpose. As the judge's wagon drew ever closer to their hard-won ground, Judge Wilson was not what Sarah had expected. Rather than the stern, authoritative figure typical of territorial judges, he was a slight man with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles and a demeanor that suggested he listened more than he spoke. This impression was confirmed as he established an impromptu court on Ezekiel's property, seated at a table hastily brought from the house. "Unusual circumstances call for unusual proceedings," he announced, arranging papers before him. "I've received communications regarding this property dispute that warrant immediate attention." The gathering had grown, with nearly 30 people, now forming a loose circle around the proceedings. The community had divided itself, quite visibly Hargrove supporters to one side, those sympathetic to Ezekiel on the other, with a cautious neutral group watching from the middle ground. "We'll begin with the current documented claims," the judge continued. "Mr. Hargrove, you're filing first." James Hargrove presented his case with the confidence of a man accustomed to getting his way, producing documents showing his claim of abandoned property, the allegedly invalid transfer to Rebecca, and supporting statements from county officials, including Sheriff Mills. Throughout his presentation, Sarah observed the judge carefully. Wilson's expression revealed nothing, but his questions were precise, focused particularly on dates and the chain of document custody. When Ezekiel's turn came, Sarah was struck by his quiet dignity. He spoke without the legal terminology she might have used, but with a clarity that cut through pretense. "I served this country for 11 years as an Army scout," he began, placing his military commendation on the judge's table. "During that time, I met and married Rebecca Johnston, daughter of the original homesteaders. Her parents disowned her, but her uncle Edward ensured the land would pass to her legally. He presented the deed from the Bible, along with Rebecca's journal documenting the transfer. After Rebecca died, I took Thomas to the reservation for a time to be with my family during our grief. When we returned to rebuild, we found our claim challenged." Jacob Turner approached next, his testimony carrying the weight of his many years in the community. "Edward Johnston told me himself that he had transferred the property legally to Rebecca. Showed me the papers before filing them. Rode Johnston told me himself that he had transferred the property legally to Rebecca. Showed me the papers before filing them. Said his brother had been wrong to disown his daughter, and he meant to right that wrong." Turner produced yellowed letters from Edward Johnston, explicitly discussing the transfer and his wishes for the property to remain with Rebecca and her family. The judge examined each document carefully before turning to Sarah. "Miss Callahan, I understand you have relevant expertise in this matter." Sarah stepped forward, acutely aware of Bancroft watching from nearby. "Yes, Your Honor. I worked as a legal secretary in Boston for several years, specializing in property law. I recognized certain patterns in the handling of Mr. Gray Elk's claim that mirrored fraudulent practices I had previously encountered. She explained the discrepancies in the county records, the evidence of tampering, and the suspicious timing of Hargrove's claim. With Mrs. Wells' documentation supporting her assertions, she built a compelling case for deliberate fraud. Thomas's contribution came unexpectedly. The boy stepped forward, clutching his slate. "I remember," he said clearly, looking directly at the judge. "Uncle Edward visit. Give papers to Mother. Say this home always yours now?" His simple testimony, the memories of a child who had been present, but silent, visibly moved many observers. This was not legal evidence in the formal sense, but in this makeshift prairie court, the authentic voice of a child who had finally found words carried undeniable power. As the presentations concluded, Judge Wilson removed his spectacles and polished them thoughtfully. "Property law exists to provide order and justice," he said at last. "When it fails to do so, we must look to the underlying principles rather than merely the procedures." He replaced his spectacles and sat straighter. "I find several troubling irregularities in Mr. Hargrove's claim. The judge's ruling was methodical and comprehensive. The original transfer to Rebecca was deemed valid based on Edward Johnston's letters and the notarized copies Mrs. Wells had preserved. The subsequent alterations to county records were found highly suspicious and warranting further investigation. Most importantly, Ezekiel's claim through marriage was upheld, with Thomas recognized as Rebecca's legitimate heir. A new deed shall be issued," Judge Wilson concluded, "properly recorded and witnessed here today." He turned to James Hargrove. "Furthermore, I am ordering an audit of all property transactions processed by the county office in the past 5 years. Mr. Hargrove, you will make yourself available for questioning regarding these matters." Hargrove's face had transformed from confidence to barely controlled fury. "This is outrageous." "I'll appeal to the territorial governor." "That is your right," the judge agreed mildly. "Though I should mention that Governor Harrison and I served together on the Territorial Commission for Fair Land Practices. He takes a particular interest in cases involving veterans like Mr. Gray Elk." As the impromptu court disbanded, Bancroft approached Sarah. "An impressive presentation, Miss Callahan. Your legal knowledge remains sharp. Will you still require me to return to Boston?" she asked directly. Bancroft considered her for a moment. "The court requires your testimony, yes. But perhaps we can arrange for a deposition to be taken here, given these extenuating circumstances." Sarah felt a weight lifting, not a complete reprieve, but a chance at resolution without losing everything she had built here. The newly authorized deed was signed and witnessed as the afternoon sun began its descent, casting long shadows across the half-built house that was now, beyond dispute, the legal property of Ezekiel and Thomas Gray Elk. 1 year later, the prairie spring painted the landscape in delicate greens and golds, so different from the stark whites and grays of the winter when their battle for the homestead had reached its climax. Sarah stood in the doorway of the completed house, watching Thomas lead his pony in careful circles near the newly fenced corral. The transformation of the property mirrored the changes in their lives. Where once there had stood only a weathered barn and stone foundation, now a sturdy 2-story home combined the best of Ezekiel's Apache building knowledge with traditional homestead design. The dwelling somehow looked as if it had always belonged on this rise, settled into the landscape with natural grace. Inside, the kitchen completed last gleamed with simple, functional beauty. Sarah moved to the iron stove, where her bread was nearly finished baking. The yeasty aroma filled the house, a sensory echo of that first loaf she had carried to the barn door what seemed a lifetime ago, the official inquiry into James Hargrove's land dealings had revealed widespread fraud affecting nearly a dozen families in the county. While he had avoided prison through political connections, his reputation and influence had crumbled. His brother William had resigned from the school board, replaced by Mrs. Wells, who proved to be an unexpectedly progressive advocate for education. Sarah had given her deposition about the Boston case, and while the courts still occasionally sent requests for clarification, Bancroft had kept his word about not requiring her physical return. The scandal had faded as newer, more sensational cases captured public attention, allowing Sarah Callahan to gradually reclaim her name and history without fear. The settlement school had initially replaced her with a teacher from Omaha, but the woman had lasted barely 2 months before the isolation of prairie life sent her fleeing back east. When the school board now, led by Mrs. Wells, had approached Sarah about resuming her position, she had accepted with one condition, that Thomas Gray Elk be welcomed as a student when he was ready. Her legal knowledge had proven unexpectedly valuable to the community. What had begun as occasional requests for help understanding documents had evolved into a formal part-time position as the county's legal advisor, working alongside Judge Wilson to ensure fair application of territorial law. The sound of Ezekiel's wagon approaching drew Sarah outside again. He returned from town less frequently these days, as his woodworking had gained recognition beyond their immediate community. The elaborate carvings that had once been limited to Thomas's toys now adorned furniture commissioned by families throughout the territory. "The Wilson order is finished," he announced as he climbed down from the wagon. And Payne asked about another display cabinet for the store. Thomas abandoned his pony practice to help unload the wagon, his voice clear and confident. As he chatted about his day's accomplishments, the silent, traumatized boy of a year ago had blossomed into a talkative child who moved easily between two cultures, sometimes serving as an unexpected bridge when other Apache families visited the nearby settlement dot as they gathered for the evening meal. Sarah placed the fresh bread in the center of the table, a golden brown loaf still steaming from the oven. The simple act carried echoes of her arrival, that first offering extended in uncertainty and hope. "County office sent this," Ezekiel said, producing an official envelope. "Your permanent appointment as legal advisor." Judge Wilson had it approved by the territorial office. Sarah accepted the letter with a smile. "I never imagined ending up in law again." "But on your own terms this time," Ezekiel observed, his perception as keen as ever. Thomas finished setting the table, proudly placing the carved wooden nameplate he had made in school beside each plate: Father, Thomas, and Sarah. The simple domestic scene belied the extraordinary journey that had brought them to this moment. Later, as the prairie sunset painted the sky in impossible colors, Sarah and Ezekiel stood in the doorway of their home, watching Thomas chase fireflies in the gathering dusk. "Rebecca would be pleased," Sarah said softly, "to see the homestead alive again." Ezekiel nodded, his hand finding hers in the fading light. "She would appreciate a woman who fought for what was right, even at great cost." "I found something worth fighting for," Sarah replied. Above them, the first stars appeared in the deepening blue. Inside, the lamp burned warm and steady, casting its glow across the threshold. Before them stretched the prairie, vast and challenging, as it had always been, but no longer quite so solitary. Sarah thought back to that first day, a desperate woman with secrets and a loaf of bread, knocking on a barn door, finding an unexpected welcome from a man and boy as wounded as herself. None of them could have imagined this outcome, this healing. "We should go in," Ezekiel said after a time. "Tomorrow comes early." Sarah nodded, but lingered a moment longer, savoring the perfect stillness of the evening. Then together they turned toward the light of home, crossing the threshold they had built, against all odds, together.